All right, everybody. It is 11:01 p.m. out here in Singapore, 11:01 East Coast time, and we are going to start today's webinar. I am Scott Anthony. I am joined by my colleague and longtime friend, Dave Duncan. We are pleased to be with you here today to talk about the Big-Event Disruption Playbook. Let me just give you a brief orientation to what we're going to go through over the course of the next hour, tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll have Dave introduce himself, and then we will get into the material. So we're going to try and do a couple things as we go through our time together today. What we really want to focus on are what are some of the key lessons that we've learned as we've looked to history, to look at what happens in the middle of big events, and most critically, what are the specific things that leaders need to do to innovate and continue to drive growth and performance in the midst of today's very challenging times. So that's the core things that we're going to talk about during the webinar today. We're going to try to make it as interactive as possible. We've got lots of opportunities to get your voice into the discussion, and we really would like to make this a conversation. For those of you who don't know Innosight, we are a growth strategy consulting company that was founded 20 years ago by our colleague Mark Johnson and the late great Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. Our mission is to empower forward-thinking organizations to navigate disruptive change and own the future. I've been part of the Innosight team since 2003. I spent the first 7 years in the United States. I spent the last 10 years out here in Singapore. I've worked with clients all around the globe and tried to progress our intellectual property as much as I can as well by writing things like this and a number of articles and books as well. Dave, you want to give a brief introduction of yourself before we get into the materials at hand?
Yes, thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone. I'm David Duncan. I'm a senior partner at Innosight. I've been there for just a little over 15 years, work in a lot of different areas, but have a particular focus on our intellectual property and client service around helping companies to innovate and institutionalize capabilities to do that, as well as our methodologies on jobs to be done. And both of those topics are things we're going to be talking about today. And thanks, everyone, for joining. Looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Let me just do then a minute of housekeeping, just so you know. The webinar is indeed being recorded. After it's done, a link to the webinar and the slides will be shared so that you can watch it again and hopefully share it with colleagues. You're only going to hear voices from me and Dave, so all of your lines have been muted. Please use the Q&A button that you see on your Zoom screen if you want to submit a question. We are going to pause at least once and hopefully twice to get to as many of your questions as we can. So feel free to submit them at any point, but we do have a couple specific moments where we are going to pause to answer those questions. Again, put it in the Q&A window. We won't see it if it's in the chat window. If you have any technical issues, you can, of course, talk in the chat window, and one of our colleagues will make sure that they address it. Finally, we've got a few poll questions that we will be running as we go through the session. When the polls pop up on the screen, make sure you click the submit button so that your vote is indeed counted. So with the housekeeping in hand, let's talk about the actual content. So in 2009, I wrote a book called The Silver Lining, and that's kind of the image in the back where you've got the sun coming through the clouds. And the basic point, the book came out in the great financial crisis, is that even in the darkest of times, there are fantastic opportunities for innovation and growth. And indeed, research that was done a few years after the global financial crisis by Gartner and Bain showed that those organizations that kept their wits about them, that made the right strategic choices, that invested in innovation, that invested in growth, were able to have outsized performance coming out of the recession that followed the global financial crisis. So history shows clearly that there are great opportunities, there are great things that can be done, no matter how challenging the times. Now, of course, it's one thing to say that, it is another thing to do it. What do you actually do if you're a leader to be the blue line on the Gartner chart or the red line on the Bain chart? What we have proposed in our recently released article is that leaders need to think across three strategic imperatives. They have to have a near-term focus on preserving the present, making sure that they have flattened the economic curve and they're solvent and they've got flexibility. They have to have a midterm rapid response strategy where they're watching the key assumptions that will determine potential outcomes. They're ready to respond, and they've got the organizational capability to be resilient and to be agile. And then there's the longer term imperative where they have to continue to own the future. They have to have a vision of the future they want to create and then be able to pull it back to today to understand the near-term things that they can do to bend the curve in a positive way and make sure they take actions in the near term that maximize their chances of creating the growth and performance they want in the long term. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go through 4 specific topics that build off this basic playbook that we have created. For each of the topic, we will highlight the parts of the playbook that are relevant, and we'll try to give you a thought or two about that particular area. These are the 4 topics we're going to go through. What changes are likely to stick after the COVID-19 pandemic recedes into the rearview mirror? What should strategic innovators do in times like this? How should leaders address unprecedented uncertainty they're all dealing with today? And importantly, how can companies maintain and build culture in a world that's changing so quickly and placing enormous stress on organizations? So those are the topics that we're going to go through today. Let's start with what changes are likely to stick. What we're going to focus on here in our Big-Event Disruption Playbook is something across all of the imperatives. We're going to think about the dislocations that could take place and stick in markets, and we're going to think about how that can then integrate into the opportunities that we ought to seize in the face of the challenges we're facing today. So let's first talk at a high level. So one of the things that Innosight regularly does with clients is take a good look in the early stages of any engagement about the underlying forces at work in an industry. What are the underlying trends that promise changes over the next 5 to 10 years? So we had a team form to try and answer a question. Which of those trends, which exist in a database that we have built over the last few years, is likely to change in some material way because of COVID-19? We started with 300 trends, the 300 most common ones we saw across industries. We used just some good wisdom of crowd work across our consulting team to get to the 50 that looked most pertinent. And then we went a level deeper to say, where do we see something where COVID-19 has either accelerated or catalyzed a trend or potentially knocked it backwards or dislocated? And to what degree do we see this as a shift that is permanent versus one that might just be temporary? And here's what we found. I won't go through all the individual circles here. I'm going to talk more about the 3 big meta themes that we saw. The first in this is no surprise is accelerated digital migration. So certainly we're all seeing a big surge in things like online retail. And on the flip side, things like ride sharing and room renting, which we've seen from recent announcements from Airbnb and others, has been dislocated, at least over the short and medium term. The second thing we see, telehealth kind of straddles across these 2, is real changes in healthcare, where infrastructure, preventative healthcare, and telemedicine are trends that we expect have been dramatically accelerated because of COVID-19. And then you've got a more macro socioeconomic change where you are seeing fragmentation beginning to set in many markets. Now, there still are a lot of questions about the degree to which this will last because you've got a lot of forces at work here, but we see some early signs that socioeconomic fragmentation is a meta trend that all industries need to be thinking about. Now let's do our first poll question here. These are the 3 big meta trends that we see. We are curious to ask you, which of these trends do you think will have most impact on your organization? So accelerated digital migration, healthcare reformation, socioeconomic fragmentation. The votes are coming in fast and furiously. We've got at the moment about 70% of people saying accelerated digital migration. Already got 70% of people who have voted just about. The next most popular one is socioeconomic fragmentation with 23%, and then healthcare reformation. Voting has slowed, so I'm going to end the polling and project this up on the screen so you can see the results that we have. Dave, I'm curious, the answers that you see here, any reaction you have to it or anything that you're seeing across the organizations you're working with or the executives you're talking to?
This certainly reflects how I would have responded and even the relative weights I would have put on these different questions. The digital migration, I mean, that was something that it's been a mega trend for quite a while. And the interesting thing now is that everybody, even at the individual level, is undergoing a digital migration, not just companies, but individuals are as they're transitioning to either working from home or managing many aspects of their personal lives remotely. So they're having to migrate, and that's going to drive accelerated migration for the companies that need to serve them and reach them and understand them.
Great. So this is a view at a macro level. Then, of course, the question that anyone's going to naturally have is, if you see these things happening at a macro level, what's going on at a more detailed level in my specific industry or the specific category in which I compete? So let's go one level deeper to talk about the changes that we see taking place, and more importantly, how you think through these types of changes. Those of you who know Innosight are probably not going to be surprised by how we answered this question. One of Innosight's core concepts, and Dave was a co-author on a book with Clayton Christensen about this a few years ago called Competing Against Luck, is the idea of the job to be done. The idea that if you want to understand markets, you want to start with the customer and the fundamental problem they are trying to solve, the job that they're struggling to get done. If you see a customer struggling and you come up with a solution that gets their job done, that's when you create innovation opportunities. We have a tool that we use called a job spec. Dave is the creator of this tool, where we go and take a job to be done and break it into 4 components. And looking through those 4 components can give you great insight into how a big event like this can drive both short and long-term job to be done dislocation. Let me go through the 4 components and give you just a general frame about it. And then, because again, Dave has spent so much time thinking about jobs to be done, I would love, Dave, to hear your specific perspectives on this, either your own personal experience or other things that you're seeing out in the market. So here are the 4 components. The first is looking at circumstances. The different circumstances we face in life affect the way that we think about different solutions. We're all now in new circumstances where we're doing virtual learning, we're all working from home, so we have no choice but to consider different solutions. If it turns out we discover a solution that gets the job done better than other solutions, we can predict that will stick. One way to think about this is to think after the COVID-19 pandemic recedes and after we're able to travel and go to places again, we expect many people will think twice before getting on a plane to go to a meeting, because they'll say, you know what, this video conferencing solutions we have actually works pretty well. The second thing we look for are the barriers that stand in the way of successfully getting a job done. A big event like this naturally has barriers that are put in place that last well beyond the big event. And the question is, where do new barriers impact the pathways and priorities people have? We think you're clearly going to see this in healthcare. Many nations are going to change the way they use their healthcare system. They're going to try to make hospitals places where people don't flock to, so you don't create hotspots for contagions, which means telemedicine is likely to continue to boom. Then you think about the way in which customers judge various solutions. People always have an algorithm in their head where they're looking at functional, emotional, and social criteria. It's implicit, they often don't think about it, but they've got a way they're judging different solutions. A big event like this can radically reorder the way people think about quality. We expect that this will lead to lasting changes for things like contactless payments, where people continue to think about health and safety, and they'll do anything they can at the margins to decrease the amount of physical activities that they have when they're touching things. Finally, this is the innovator's opportunity. Where is there a place where innovators come in with a new solution that gets the job done better in a sustainably better way? One of the big opportunities we see right now is providing virtual learning for children. The solutions that exist right now are as good as they can be, but they have lots of room for improvement. Right now, we expect most parents will want their kids to go back to school as quickly as possible. But if an innovator came in right now with a delightful way to educate a young child, they've got a ready market, and that change could stick and persist. So again, Dave, would love to hear your perspectives on this, some of your own firsthand experiences here, and some of the additional ways that you think through this particular question.
Yeah, two I guess main points, and you know, we tend to approach problems at Innosight and Huron with a set of tools and lenses that, particularly in times that are as uncertain as they are now, are a really helpful guide to making sense of what's going on. And this lens of jobs to be done, I think, is one of our most, if not the most, powerful lenses we have for just making sense of what's happening and figuring out how to respond to it. And I guess the first comment I'd make is that jobs tend to be enduring, and many of the jobs that we had before any of us knew about COVID-19 are still there. They're still very important to us. There might be some new ones that have popped up, and then there might be some old ones that don't seem as important right now. But most of the jobs we had before the crisis are still there. So for example, I have a daughter who is in elementary school, and I have a job to be done, a perpetual job to be done for her to get an education. And just because her school decided almost overnight that the rest of the semester was going to transition to virtual delivery as opposed to bricks and mortar school that she attends, that job didn't change at all. I still have that job. But what's changed is all of the other things that are listed on these pages that are elements of how you understand how to solve for the job. So obviously we're in a new circumstance now where we're at home all the time and we have to solve for that job from home. There's barriers to getting it done related to access to any kind of group activity or physical space. We are adapting. I don't think our definition of quality changed. It's, we're really interested in a high level of quality we're solving for that job, but we certainly are adapting to new types of trade-offs that we're having to make, and there are new solutions that we're having to adapt to. And I give her school an incredible amount of credit for ramping up and switching to a virtual model, within weeks, having no experience in doing that. And so I think from a application perspective, then I would say the first thing that you need to do is figure out what are the jobs that you were solving for before the crisis, and get really clear on the nature of those jobs. And that often takes some work, and it also takes a language and a way to talk about those jobs. We find this jobs to be done vocabulary to be a very useful language for doing that. And then once you've understood what those jobs were, assuming that your customers still have them, start to cycle through these questions and figure, well, what exactly has changed? And given the different answers you might have to these different questions, what are the implications for how you're going to innovate in order to continue solving those jobs?
Great. I have two follow-on questions for you, Dave. Number one, has your appreciation of teachers gone up or down during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, it was already very, very high, and it's gone up even more. And I have to say, I've been incredibly impressed. I'll give a shout out to her school. It's called Rocky Hill Country Day School in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. They've been incredible in their adaptability and the learning they've had to go through in order to adapt to this new reality and still deliver an extremely high quality educational experience. And I appreciate not only their skill at teaching, but also their ability to adapt and innovate in response to what's happening.
I'll give a shout out to Little Hands Montessori School in Singapore. Our 3-year-old goes there, and they've done a fantastic job in adapting to the circumstance. My other quick question for you is, I remember a few weeks ago you were talking about new solutions. You said you might even experiment with giving yourself a haircut. Did you actually run that experiment?
I did run that experiment, and I suppose I'll let the participants in the webinar judge the quality of the outcome. But I have to say it was something I probably never would have tried if this hadn't been forced to do this. And I think one of the ideas behind this idea of a jobs to be done with dislocation is that so many people are being forced to try things that they wouldn't have tried before. And some of those things are going to stick because just by virtue of getting them over the energy and inertia barrier of trying it for the first time, they're going to realize it's not that bad, or maybe it's even better than what they were doing before.
And we certainly are seeing that with the way that workforces are designed. People said there's no way that we can handle this kind of remote work, but it turns out we actually can. And again, this is the innovator's opportunity right now, because the needs are there, the jobs to be done are there, the challenges are there. And if you look back at history speaks again very clearly about the opportunities that exist in moments like this. In the silver lining, we said that there are a couple things that you generally see when there's some kind of big event of recession, depression, there's a socioeconomic event and so on, that we would expect to see an event like this one as well. So one thing that you see persistently is companies can make bold moves to significantly outpace competitors. As an example, Adobe is a company that we have highlighted in other research for driving an aggressive dual transformation strategy, moving from packaged software to software as a service in its traditional business and moving into advertising services and analytics in its new business. That started in 2007, right at the outset of the global financial crisis. So you're going to see the same thing here. Companies that can keep their heads up in the midst of all the tumultuous change can do tremendous things. The other thing that we have noticed persistently is there are opportunities to start or scale innovations that reverb, that echo off of the disruption. So Toyota really becomes Toyota in the 1970s after the oil crisis. The small car that's fuel efficient all of a sudden looks like a godsend. Sony becomes Sony when it introduces the transistor radio in the midst of the Asian flu in 1957, something that allows people to safely listen to things without going to physical events, meets customers exactly where they are. There were about 100 unicorns that were born from 2007 to 2009, privately held companies that had valuations more than $1 billion. And many of them, again, reverbed off the global financial crisis, like asset sharing platforms and new payment mechanisms. And you do have these companies that are on the brink of driving big growth that do tremendous things in the face of a downturn. So back in the silver lining in 2009, we highlighted Facebook, LinkedIn, Alibaba, and a few others, companies that were known and had made progress, but still weren't that big, all less than $1 billion in revenue. Those companies, like we had seen in every other recession, took a big leap forward. We've been doing research on this right now to try to identify current on-the-brink disruptors that we think are very well positioned to drive substantial growth in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you see some of the ones on the screen here. You've got Peloton, which had a little bit of a bumpy ride over the past couple years, but now appears to be really well positioned to take advantage of many of the forces at work. Or you've got Twitch, a video gaming platform that Amazon bought a couple years ago for about $1 billion that is now one of the only places you can go to if you actually want to see live sports. Of course, it's e-gaming as opposed to traditional sports, but the platform is booming. And a number of other things that take advantage of some of the meta trends we talk about that are rightly positioned for job to be done dislocations and really set to drive big growth. So Dave, beyond the things that are on the page here, or maybe even among the things that are on the page, what are you watching? What do you think is an interesting company, innovation, startup that is well positioned to thrive in the midst of today's tough times?
Well, by a remarkable coincidence, two of the ones I was going to talk about are Peloton and Twitch, because I thought that they were really had tailwinds. But I will make one additional comment about Peloton, which is I think, it's not just that they have a great kind of exercise at home solution for people that are trapped at their home, but I think one of the things that makes people so engaged with it is that there's this community where you can exercise as part of a group in real time with a coach and online with you, and it creates this kind of community experience that is maybe not a substitute for what you would get in an actual in-person class, but it's addressing more than just the functional exercise jobs and the health-related jobs. There's that community social job and that sense of connectedness, and that's certainly, I think, a whole category of jobs that are have become much more acutely felt and unsatisfied as we're also isolated at home. So I think they're kind of riding a double wave there. Certainly Twitch, I had a similar reaction, this idea that, people are looking for, again, gets back to the jobs to be done, right? What are the jobs you have for which you hire sporting events? It has to do with the excitement of competition, the sense of community, the sense of cheering for somebody. I mean, there's a whole range of jobs to be done there. And again, esports may not be exact substitute for that, but it's something that's approaching that. Certainly there's a lot of, digital health related companies like Teladoc that I think are really well positioned to unlock a lot of value now that I think the crisis is kind of forcing potentially some big changes in the healthcare industry as well.
Awesome. I saw someone in the chat window said, why is Zoom not on the list? Well, one of our criteria was having revenue below a certain threshold, and Zoom has already crossed it. So Zoom was disqualified because it already had proven that it was going to be successful. So, or proven at least through one financial metric that it was going to be successful. All right, fantastic. So that's the first topic, what changes are likely to stick. We're going to now do the second topic, and then after this one, we will pause to take some of the questions that are coming in. What do you do if you're a strategic innovator in the face of all this change, all this uncertainty, and yes, all this opportunity? So what we're going to really focus on here is making sure you take the right near-term actions to maximize flexibility to go and do everything else that's on the page here. And the simplest answer that we give really comes from some of the chapter heads back in The Silver Lining. And one of the reasons why the book was called The Silver Lining is because one of the good things about being in a circumstance like this, if you focus on innovation, is you will be forced to do things that you should have been doing already. So the things we're going to go through here are not rocket science. They're not things that are dissimilar to general advice that you would give innovators, but you have no choice when you're in the midst of something that will constrain your resources other than to do these things. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight 4 of the chapters, just give a sentence about each. We'll do a poll to say which of these is most challenging in your organization. We'll comment on the poll, and then we'll open it up for questions from the group. And again, we've got 2 other topics after this. So first, prune prudently. Resources are going to be more constrained. There is no doubt about it. Almost every innovation portfolio we have ever looked at suffers from what we call the plague of the zombie project, the walking undead, the project that if you are honest about it will never have impact. You should have already gotten rid of your zombies. You have no choice but to do it now so you can focus on the most critical opportunities. Refeature to cut costs. A lot of people are going to be told to do more with less. The jobs to be done lens here is critical because after all, you can't do more with less unless you understand what more means, which means deep customer centricity, stakeholder centricity, trying to understand the problems the ecosystem is trying to solve so you can deliver something that's still good even if you're doing it at a lower cost rate. Smart strategic experiments. It's never been easier to do this, which means you've got to be even more disciplined in how you go and smartly learn about key assumptions behind your ideas. 2014, I had a book called The First Mile that had 2 acronyms to help with this process. The first one is DEFT, where anytime you're working on an idea, you start by documenting it. You then evaluate it from multiple angles. You focus on the areas of greatest uncertainty, and you test rapidly and you learn quickly so you can iterate your way to success. Hope helps you design successful experiments. Like a scientist, you start with the hypothesis, you have an objective for your experiment, you predict what you think will happen, and then you execute in a way in which you can measure your prediction and take action because of it. Finally, share the innovation load. A mistake people make is they think that innovators take risk. Good innovators don't take risk. They know what they're doing is risky already. They find ways to smartly manage it. If you're not doing open innovation now is the time to really do it. Find ways to share the innovation load more broadly so you can do more with the more constrained resources that you have. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about each of these points, but we wanted to at least give you the headline and then open up our second poll here to see which one you think is hardest for your organization. Prudent portfolio pruning, customer-centric cost cutting, smart strategic experiments, and sharing the innovation load. Well, we've got a horse race going on here, Dave. We've got, let's see, some material votes for everything. We've got the number 1 answer so far is smart strategic experiments. We've got more than half of the people who have voted. That's getting 40% of the vote. Number 2 is prudent pruning. Number 3 is sharing the innovation load. Number 4 is customer-centric cost cutting. I'll wait about 5 more seconds because the votes are still coming in. We're up to 168 votes, which is a good number. They appear to have slowed down, but that's 5 seconds. So we will end the poll and we will share the results. So smart strategic experiments came out as number 1. Dave, any reflections you have on what you see here? Any advice that you give to the audience about any of these topics?
Yeah, so all of these things are important, and I guess that's reflected in the split in the relative votes for answers. And our perspective at Innosight and Huron is that innovation is a system challenge. So companies that are trying to get better at innovation need to think holistically about how to enable that. And, you know, which means if you're going to get better at doing smart strategic experiments, you need to think about how those experiments are connected to and informed by the strategic context you're in, right? It's not just about having a great process that's bespoke and it's able to rapidly learn and carry out these experiments and pivot and all of the things that we know you're supposed to do when you do experiments. There are other system level considerations, like making sure you have strategic clarity on what experiments you need to run and why, right? So there needs to be that connection to strategy. Then they need to be connected to resource allocation, obviously, which is another thing that we see within the overall system, often getting in the way of running successful experiments, is that people will run them, and then once they learn what the results are, there isn't a tight enough connection with resource allocation mechanisms to scale up if need be, or they might actually be reluctant to stop experimenting. This is one of the root causes of zombies, right? Because the way resource allocation has worked is that the organization has already allocated so many resources to a particular project that there's this sense that we've committed and we've got to see it through no matter what. Like just stopping it as a result of a negative experiment would be perceived as a costly failure. And then, you know, the last thing I would say about it from this kind of system perspective is it's not just the mechanisms for doing the experiments that have to be designed and carried out well. You need the people, the managers who are reviewing and overseeing those experiments to be on the same page with respect to what the outcomes need to be, so that they're asking the right questions of the teams conducting the experiments and not reinforcing, you know, the wrong types of behaviors.
Excellent. And as Dave said, there's so much to say about this topic. You know, we have written lots of articles and books around these things that you can find on our website, but hopefully that gives you a greater sense as to some of the practical ways you can think through these issues. So let's now take a pause for questions from the group. So I will put up the slide that reminds us that we were taking questions from the group. And I was looking through the Q&A while also listening to Dave's excellent answer. And I see many great questions here. I think I'm going to aspire, just looking at the time, to do 3 now, and then we have another question break a little bit later on to catch more of them. The first is a simple one. The job spec, we've got one person, Dave, who liked the job spec idea and just wants to know where they can learn more about it. So those who want to learn more about the different categories that are in that job spec, where would you point them to learn more about it?
I'll point them to an article that Scott and I are writing that hopefully will be out in the next 2 or 3 weeks. It's a relatively new, I guess, frame for just how to think about the tools that support jobs to be done research, and it doesn't actually exist in anything that's written currently, but we'll be putting something out really soon.
And I do think, you know, that your book, it doesn't use that exact language because job spec is something, but the idea of barriers and circumstances and the different criteria people use, you've got all the tools to be able to at least begin to piece together something that looks like it from the book. I think that's fair to say, right?
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah. So the book, Competing Against Luck, it introduces these terms and kind of explains the definitions and how they fit together, using slightly different language, but the core ideas are there.
All right, then this is an interesting one. I see some operational leaders overloaded with trends and choosing to assume that effects are overblown. They believe things will return to status quo for their business. How would you encourage them to begin imagining changes to their business? So I'll provide a couple thoughts to that, and then Dave would love to hear anything else that you have to say about it. I would say 2 things. I'd say, number one, I would return, as Dave said, to the job to be done. And if you understand the job you currently are doing, and that's not easy, people often don't understand it, but if you understand that and you start to disaggregate it to the 4 things we talked about in the job spec, it gives you a better way to have a conversation about what's going to change and what isn't going to change. That's point number one. Point number two, you always learn something from walking a mile in people's shoes, or whatever is the equivalent in the country that you're from. So you'd ask the executives to go out there and experience what the customer, what the stakeholder, what the supplier is experiencing. This is something interesting that we've seen with one of the organizations we work with in Singapore, DBS, who I'll talk about in just a little bit. It has been a great accelerator of some of their change efforts to have the senior leaders have the same kind of pain that the rank and file have had for longer periods of time, because once they experience the pain of internal systems, they say, well, we got to fix this. So that would be the thing I would do, is have people get a chance to experience it, so they're not just reacting on their instincts. They've actually gone and seen and been with and done the same sorts of things, so they can understand a little bit more from firsthand views. Dave, curious to see if there's anything that you would build to that or build on that.
Yeah, I read there as being two questions here. One is just, how do you filter through all of the trends that are coming at you? And then secondly, how do you break out of your current frame of reference to imagine how things could be different for your own business? On the first question, the way we think about organizing and managing, the 300 trends that might be underway in any given industry and trying to make sense of them, is they can kind of all be filtered through and organized as impacting some of the core categories that you need to consider when you're developing a strategy, right? So they can all be kind of boiled down to who are the customers of the future, and how are their jobs to be done, or their needs going to change, right? That's one category of it. What business models and competitors are going to be competing to solve for those jobs, and on what basis? What's going to be the basis of competition? And then where is there going to be value to be captured in the future ecosystem that gets configured around those jobs and those competitive games that are being played? And in general, you can find a way to connect any trend to one of those three categories of implications for strategy development. And personally, I just find that to be a useful way to organize, all the things coming at you. On the second one, on breaking out of your frame of reference, there's a whole bunch of ways to do that. And I think many of them are detailed nicely in this latest book that's a couple of our colleagues, Mark Johnson and Josh Suskovitz, have written, Lead from the Future, which is about strategy development. And there are things you can do to break out of your frame of reference. One is to just think about a long-term time horizon, whether it's 5 years or 10 years. It's often hard to contemplate really different moves when your planning horizon is just a year or even 2 years from now, because it just seems you see all of the impediments to doing something really different, and you get overwhelmed by them. Whereas if you force yourself, just as a thought experiment, to think out further, you can kind of take those blinders off and at least think more expansively initially before you put those blinders back on. Another trick that sometimes works is to imagine that you're not. You do all of the things Scott suggested, understand jobs to be done, understand kind of how those are changing, and then imagine that you weren't part of your company, but that you were going to start a business, a startup, and you had funding to go after that opportunity. Would you choose to do? And does that inspire any thinking about what you might do now that you put back on the frame of reference of who you actually are in the organization that you're part of? And there's a range of, I'd say, frame of reference shifting tricks like that you can try.
Fantastic. Well, Dave, it was such a rich answer to the question. And as I look at some of the other questions, a lot of them are covered in the next couple of areas that I'm going to go on to the next area. I should say, for those of you, and I see some good friends and family of Innosight, I see some alums out there, other people we've worked with in the Q&A. Hey, everybody. Those questions that we don't answer live, we will type up the best job that we can to answer them and send to this group, printed out, typed up answers to them. So we will get to all the questions, even if we don't get to do them live. So let's go to the third topic, because this is something that came up in 3 or 4 of the things in the Q&A window. How should leaders address the massive uncertainty they're facing today? And what this really is about is focusing on some of the underlying assumptions that will determine what you're going to do in the near term and what you're going to do on the longer term. And one of the key words that we want to pull out of this is the word align. Me, along with our colleague Bernard Kummerly and one of our clients, Marcus Messerer, wrote an article a couple years ago called Unite Your Senior Team. And the basic challenge that we identified is even teams that think they're aligned, that are in meetings where everyone says this is what we're going to do and they're all nodding their heads up and down, find that when they leave the meeting, what was actually happening is in people's brains, they were shaking it from side to side, is they didn't actually agree with the outcome. And because of that, when they left the room, they all went in completely different directions. So we've got a couple quick poll questions that we want to ask to see if this is the circumstance in your organization. The first is to see the degree to which you've got an aligned view of the future. So the question is, to what degree do you agree with this statement? Our leadership team has an aligned view of the future, from highly disagree up to highly agree. And I'm going to, just in the interest of time, I'll give about 35 seconds because there are 2 poll questions that we want to do. So press quickly so we can make sure that your vote is counted. We've got a good distribution here, Dave. We've got about 43% that somewhat or highly agree. It's higher than the last group I was with. So you're a forward-thinking group that we have here. And 46% that highly disagree or somewhat disagree. So pretty nice distribution. Actually, very few in the middle, which is interesting. So it's kind of a 2 fat tails. So let's show the results of that one on the screen, where 43% gave it a 4 or 5, 47% gave it a 1 or 2. So we've got a group here that's not aligned, which is interesting. And then let us do the last poll question here. And the last poll question of the webinar, indeed, which is, as you go 1 level deeper and look at the assumptions behind success, that your leadership team has identified and articulated the key assumptions behind their strategy. To what degree do you agree with this statement? And again, we'll give 30 seconds or so for you to answer this. And here, consistent with the last group that I asked this question to, we're getting something that skews a little bit more on the negative side, where maybe we had 44% or so that somewhat or highly agree with the last one, and here we've got just 33%. Okay, let's show the results. So we have 34% that somewhat or highly agreed, and here we had 58% that somewhat or highly disagreed. Dave, those results ring true to you? Is that something similar do you see with the organizations that you work with, or that we more broadly work with at Innosight?
Yeah, I think you would see results like this in many organizations. I think one thing that you and your co-authors do such a wonderful job of explaining in this article that's referenced here at the bottom, Unite Your Senior Team, which I highly recommend to everybody to go read, is that there are these kind of psychological pitfalls that everybody naturally falls prey to, where you think you're more aligned than you are, and maybe you think you're more precise about your assumptions about the future than you actually are. So it'd be interesting to know, whether these poll results are biased by those psychological biases that you so artfully describe in your article. And that's I guess my only comment is that it's worth taking a look at that, because I think it's excellent.
Well, we thought it was a good article too, so thank you for the shout out. And kind of the too long don't read summary of the article says, if you want to unite your senior team, there's a 3-step process to follow. There's always a 3-step process, right? So the first part is making sure that, consistent with one of the things Dave said before about jobs to be done, that you've got a common language. You've got common ways to frame things like, what business are we in? What does innovation mean? What does transformation mean? And so on. Second, rather than running away from misalignment, you put it right in the middle of the table. You get really clear about where everyone stands, about what the assumptions they're making, so you can have good, honest conversations about them. Then finally, you don't try to align by talking, you try to align by walking. You use physical techniques like the walk the line exercise we discuss in the article, where you take something where there's a numerical answer, like how much growth are you going to get next year, how much cost savings do you need, whatever, and you put range on the floor on a piece of tape, and then you move to physical locations that show your individual perspective on a topic. You then have people argue until they ultimately come closer to consensus about the answer. And research done at SMU and other places shows that this leads to alignment that sticks more deeply than what happens when you sit around a table and talk. Now, behind a lot of this is having a clear view about the underlying assumptions that ultimately will determine your future outcome. And there's a pretty straightforward process that you can follow to do this in the midst of something like COVID-19. You start by saying, what are the key variables that ultimately will determine different potential outcomes? Then what are some of the broad scenarios we need to think about, the famous letters that people are talking about today, the W, L, V, U, or whatever shaped recovery we're going to ultimately see. You then find the key assumptions, not that have the most sensitivity on the final number, but determine the path that you follow. They're outcome determining assumptions. You start to say, what are the different scenarios that we might be in our industry? You figure out a causal model that says what's going to cause what to determine what place we might get into. You then model the impact that will have specific to your economics and some of the strategic bets that you're making. And you then integrate all of this into your current strategy. This is not rocket science. This is work that has been well detailed for a couple generations, but really important work to help people manage the uncertainty they currently face. Now, Dave, I said this isn't rocket science, but it's not easy to do either. Which of these things do you think is the big tripping point as people seek to do this type of work?
So I'd say that the biggest thing is that people are looking, naturally looking for a quantifiable answer that is based on, that's derived from data in a kind of logically certain way, in the same way that you might make projections for what you expect to happen over the next 3 to 6 months, where you have a lot more certainty, there's a lot more data you can rely on, and you can just be more confident that whatever it is you're projecting is actually going to happen the way it is. And so when you shift to trying to think about a longer term time horizon or a greater magnitude of change, you naturally want to carry over that same set of approaches and mindsets. And I think the trick with this type of work is that there's a role for quantification and rigor for sure, but it's often more about being precise about a stake in the ground for what the future would look like on certain dimensions, and then doing a pretty rigorous thought exercise about what you would have to believe for that scenario to be true, right? And it's less about deriving the answer and having it spit out at the end of a bunch of calculations, and more about asserting an answer and then backing out of that what you have to believe as a kind of logical consequence. And then if there are things that don't make sense, then you adapt your guess about what that future is going to look like and do that again. And of course, you want to then check what comes out of that with some quantitative points of reference. But it's just a fundamentally different exercise that is more about visioning and logic than it is about precise projections. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think a critical thing that people need to have is to be able to essentially toggle between the logical, rigorous, analytical brain and the one that can deal with the sorts of things we talked about here, which is not, of course, easy to do. One more word about this topic before we quickly go through our last topic and maybe get one more question in before we call it a webinar. That activity of walking the line obviously is something you're not going to physically do right now when most people are working remotely. There is a real digital silver lining that we've observed when people are using new techniques in virtual form, and I think in some cases getting even better alignment among their team. It starts with making very clear upfront what are the guidelines of a discussion that you're going to have to make sure that you're all entering into a space thinking the right way. Then it's using creative tools. We hacked together something very simply that would do a virtual version of the walk the line activity. In this case, we even had somebody walk the grid where they took an emerging opportunity and they went on essentially a 2x2 chart. How attractive is it? What is the right to win in the space? And each of those dots was an individual person, and it was displayed live on screen and we could discuss and debate it. And then take advantage of the tools where you can have full visibility and see where everyone thinks, you see their facial expressions and so on, and you can have a fully inclusive discussion. And we've seen some interesting things happen with hierarchy. If you don't have a big table and the most important person isn't sitting in a particular seat, all of a sudden the discussion opens up a ton. There's a real digital silver lining for those who embrace it that can enable better alignment, better inclusivity in discussions, and ultimately lead you to a better future. Finally, just a couple words about maintaining and building culture. This is going to be a key thing about the second imperative about a rapid response strategy. The thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to need to be more agile. You're going to need to be more responsive. So what I want to do is tell a quick story, and those of you who have been on past webinars, you can press snooze for about 3 minutes because you might have heard this story before. It's DBS Bank. If you haven't listened, it's a good story. Even if you have listened, it's a good story about the transformation it made and the tool that you can use to help you manage the adaptability that you need to build into your organization as you learn your way to the future. So 11 years ago, DBS was a boring, regulated, process-focused bank. Today, DBS is globally recognized as a digital powerhouse. How did that happen? Obviously, there's a lot of investment in technology, but the big thing that happened was a cultural transformation. Piyush Gupta, its CEO, essentially summarizes it by saying, we needed to go from being a bank where the bias was towards obligatory compliance to functioning like a 27,000 person startup. How do you do that? Well, you start by defining what a 27,000 person startup does. It's agile. It has to be a learning organization. It has to be customer obsessed, data driven, and experimental. You then say, what are the things we're doing that are stopping us from doing this today? Innovation is something different that creates value. You have to do something different in order to innovate, and your existing habits, existing routines are the things that often stop you from innovating. Here's an example. DBS said one of the big barriers inhibiting innovation was meetings. Meetings were not collaborative and they were not productive. They would start late, they would end later, there were no clear conclusions. So they introduced a ritual called Meeting Mojo. Every meeting has a Mo, the meeting owner, that makes sure the meeting starts on time and ends on time and there are clear outcomes. The Joe is the joyful observer. They're watching the meeting. They're making sure everyone is present, everyone is participating. They're giving feedback to the Mo at the end of the meeting publicly in front of the group. This has worked. The percent of people who say meetings are collaborative has gone from 40% to 90%. And DBS has saved 500,000 employee hours by making meetings more productive. Now, DBS has done a ton of other things like this. I won't go through all of these. I'll just share one more, the Gandalf Scholarship. We want to learn more in our organization. How do we do this? At DBS, anyone who wants to learn anything can get 1,000 Singapore dollar scholarship to go and learn it as long as they teach it back to the organization. People have learned hard skills like how do you go and do AI or big data analytics. They've learned things like storytelling, and DBS has found this is an incredibly effective way to train and develop its people. There is a common element between each of the things here, some of which are described in a recent article that I wrote with Paul Cobbin, co-author of the forthcoming book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate, and the Chief Data and Transformation Officer from DBS, and Natalie Pinchot, our Innosight colleague. Rahul Nair was the co-author of the article, Andy Parker of the book. The core idea here is if you want to change habits, you use what we call a BEAN, a behavior enabler, artifact, and nudge. The behavior enabler is the direct way to enable behavior change. This is executing or driving system 2 in Daniel Kahneman's language, where you got to think hard about the new thing that you're doing. You need the ritual, you need the checklist to do it. The nudge is the system 1 that you're activating. It is the indirect, the invisible way you're encouraging behavior change, like the Joe sitting in the room and watching. Even though it's not something that ultimately says something, it nudges the group to think and act in different ways. And then the artifact is the connective tissue that brings those two things together. It is the reminder that this is what you need to do to reinforce that behavior change. As you have organizations seeking to more rapidly learn, these are the kind of barriers you see, and these are the kind of tools that are described in our forthcoming book to go and address it. If you lack clarity about our most critical assumptions, follow what Google does and make sure that you ask the hard question first. If you want to build a pedestal that has a talking monkey on it, the pedestal doesn't matter. Figuring out how to make a monkey talk, that's difficult. So get the critical assumptions out there first. You want to make sure that people share bad news, run a pre-mortem like Atlassian, so people are conditioned to the fact that innovation doesn't always work out. You're worried about groupthink, where decisions are made by the highest paid person's opinion, or people who have zero evidence, but they're really arrogant, hippos and zebras. Do something like what Pixar does by creating a brain trust of really smart people who have a specific job to criticize some of the best directors in the world as they're working on movies. These are specific things that can help make you more agile and more responsive. Now, Dave, I'm watching the clock here. We've got about 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is remind people of the 4 topics we talked about. We talked about looking at some of the meta trends and job to be done dislocations to identify changes that are likely to stick. We talked about smart experimentation and prudent pruning to help strategic innovators move forward. We talked about getting really clear about assumptions and using new alignment techniques to help to address uncertainty. And we talked about the bean to help people maintain and build culture. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take one last question from what we talked about here, and Dave, I'll give it to you, and you've got 90 seconds to answer it, and then I will summarize. There's a lot of things about links. We'll make sure that we summarize those, and we'll then 90 seconds to summarize, and we'll call it a webinar. So there was a question I saw before that I wanted to get up here about cash being king. Yeah, so this is from our good friend Vince Tobias. Hello, Vince. It's always good to have you on. Various consultants say that in times of distress and uncertainty, cash is king. If that's so, it's even harder to make bold moves in the future. How do you manage that? If cash is king, how do you still invest in the future? Dr. David Duncan, you've got 90 seconds to say something brilliant.
So end with a really hard question and high expectations. So I think when we're working with leadership teams on strategy development, and it's typically oriented towards a long-term growth strategy and a long-term perspective. And back to our earlier conversation about how do you get out of the kind of tyranny and urgency of the near term and think longer term. You need to have a point of view on how much you want to grow over the long term, and then what are the big buckets of growth? How is that growth going to disaggregate across the large categories of sources of growth, right? So, of the growth that we want to achieve, how much is going to come from our core business that we can kind of count on? How much is going to come from maybe some adjacencies that we have identified and we're still working out, but we've got a full idea of what they're going to be, and then how much is going to come from something that we haven't even conceived of yet, and therefore there's this big gap, or hopefully a smaller gap relative to our aspiration. And having a clear view about what that equation is, sometimes we call that the growth equation that adds up to your future growth, gives you a sense of how much investment you need to allocate to the more transformational things. And you can kind of back out, therefore, how you want to balance resources across innovation, new business models, versus investing more in your core. But they're really, that's probably the best answer I can give. That's a kind of analytical answer for how to think about how much cash you need to free up and allocate to different types of activities.
Dave, it is a brilliant answer because it allows me to neatly transition to what I'm going to offer to the group as a conclusion. So my friend Michael Putz and I had an article in the Slow Management Review a couple months ago that talked about the lies leaders tell themselves that make it hard for them to respond to disruptive change. And I won't read through them here. You can go and download the article. But there's a big lie that we didn't capture in this article that has been laid bare in the COVID-19 crisis, which is people saying, well, that sounds nice, but now isn't the right time. I can't focus on growth. I can't focus on the future because I'm so overwhelmed by the present. Remember what the Cheshire Cat said to Alice in Alice in Wonderland. Alice is lost. She asked the Cheshire Cat for directions. He says, well, where do you want to go? And she says, well, I don't know. And he says, well, it doesn't really much matter which way you go then. Because if you don't know where you're going, any road can take you there. You have no choice but to consider the future, because every decision you make today, what you cut, what you keep, what you invest in, markets you enter, markets you exit, they will have implications about your future direction. Your choice is whether to be courageous and consciously consider the future by doing the things that Dave talked about here and the other things we talked about in the webinar. Of course, connecting it to the present activities you're doing, but with an eye on the horizon and the future. Or if you don't do that, to unconsciously prioritize the present. You follow that approach, it's very easy to wake up in 18 months with a very different type of crisis, where the gap between where you are and where you want to get to is simply unsolvable. We believe that there are great opportunities in the midst of the worst times that you can imagine. It's hard, there's no doubt about it, but we think those that think and act in the right way can deflect the threats, can seize the opportunities, can navigate today's disruptive times, and ultimately own the future. Thank you all very much for your participation in this webinar. We didn't get to all the great questions that came in, but we will again make sure that we summarize our answers to them and send them out to you. Thank you very much. Stay safe, stay sane. Good luck and happy innovating. Thanks, Dave, for all your great participation during the discussion as well.
All right, thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone.